Hello comrades, and welcome to lecture 4 of SOCI 4002, Foundations of Social Theory, where today we shall be exploring the sociology of Karl Marx and Marxism. Marx was born in 1818. He is thus the earliest of the three so-called founding fathers of sociology, which we will be exploring. We looked at Emil Durkheim last week, it's Marx this week, and next week we'll look at the work of Max Weber. But recall, before we looked at these founding fathers, we spoke about the founding grandfather, for want of a better word, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who Durkheim wrote his PhD dissertation on and claimed was the true founder of sociology, or what then was perhaps better known as social philosophy. Many of the key themes we've explored in Rousseau's work are particularly relevant today, so I encourage you to flick back over your notes briefly to ensure you have a good understanding of Rousseau's work before we talk about Marx. So say it's worth contextualising Marx relative to the other so-called founding fathers. Marx born in 1818, that's 46 years before Max Weber and 40 years before Durkheim. Marx thus was foundational in the 1848 revolutions which took place across Europe, and the Communist Manifesto, co-authored with Friedrich Engels, spoke to these conflicts and changes which were occurring, which Marx was an active part. He was aged 30. This was occurring 20 years before Weber and Durkheim were even born. When we're discussing the rapid dynamic changes of modernity, industrialization and urbanization, decades make a big difference. While whole books and essay collections have been written on individual aspects of Marx's theory, I'm going to try and do in this brief lecture is to give you an overview of the core insights of a Marxist sociology. In this regard, you'll be introduced to historical materialism, alienation, ideology, dialectics, the materialist inversion of Hegelian idealism, and the theory of surplus value, presented as MCM apostrophe. In summary, MCM is a particular understanding of the extractive nature of capitalism. It is the core formula which explains for Marxists how profit occurs at the basis of the exploitation of the labour of the proletariat. But before we dive into these deep and controversial ideas, I think it's worth stepping back a second. Just step back one level and just explain something which may seem self-evident, which is that Marxism offers a conflict theoretical understanding of society. For Marxists, society is not a harmonious, happy equilibrium. Rather, society is dominated by the interests of a small group of people, the bourgeoisie, who dominate and exploit the vast majority of people, the proletariat. In this regard, Marxism could be seen as similar to a feminist approach or an ecological approach, in that society is understood as fundamentally being built on domination and control. Civil society, as per Rousseau's analysis, is thus understood as a blocker of revolution, is understood as an ideological veil to prevent radical change towards a more rational and equitable society. The first thing to make sure you have down in your notes, and it is self-evident, but it's important, this understanding that Marxists view society as being in conflict. And the questions they ask is, what is the nature of this conflict? And how is it that this conflict hasn't come to its natural conclusion? Marx wrote and read extensively. He even wrote poetry. He was fascinated by Greek literature. He famously read Appian in the bath. However, for the purposes of this lecture, we'll be talking about just 6 of his key works, and these will be just briefly flowing in and out of our discussion. The first is his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The second is the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. The third is the German ideology, which includes the famous theses on Feuerbach. We're talking about the Communist Manifesto, as previously mentioned, the Grundrisse, or the groundwork, which is the foundations for his major project, perhaps the book for which he is most well known, Capital. While Marx completed the first volume of Capital in his lifetime, the subsequent volumes were written from his notes by Engels as he passed away before he completed it. So let's get going then. Let's try and understand the mind of Karl Marx. What exactly was the core of his philosophy, of his sociology? As we explored in the first lecture, a foundational thinker for contemporary sociology, the philosopher who influenced so much of today's sociology, is Hegel. And Hegel is a particularly difficult theorist to understand. At the core of Hegel's philosophy is the idea of conflict and of change. In particular, Hegel suggests a dialectical account of change, in which ideas come into conflict. One idea, which you can refer to as a thesis, meets an opposing idea, which Hegel calls an antithesis. What occurs is that these two ideas fight it out, and the relative strengths of them both come together in a synthesis, a combination of the two. Hegel's account is very much idea-centric. We can see ideas dominating the social world. For Hegel, the world around us is the product of this conflict of ideas. Hegel was thus an idealistic theorist. Idealist not in the sense that he views things as being for the best, but idealist in the sense that he views things as being a product of ideas. Marx was very interested in Hegel's work. Marx was one of a group of the so-called young Hegelians who read Hegel's work passionately with an interest in its potential political use to make the world a better place. While Hegel had analysed the changes and transitions which occurred in society and produced this very sophisticated understanding of conflict leading to transition, of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, Hegel came to the conclusion that actually society had reached its apotheosis. With the Prussian state of his day, Hegel concluded that this dialectic had ended and that the Prussian state was the manifestation of freedom. Hegel's approach to understanding conflict thus became a conservative way of justifying the current status quo. There should be no further conflict. This dialectic of thesis, antithesis, creating new syntheses should come to an end. There should be no further dialectical progression for Hegel, because quite simply, the Prussian state was the end of the dialectic. We had reached a rational society with the Kaiser, as far as Hegel was concerned. The reception of Hegel's ideas was thus split between the so-called left or young Hegelians and the right Hegelians. The left Hegelians, such as Marx, wanted to use Hegel's method, use his dialectical approach to continue social critique, to try and move beyond the limitations of the Prussian state. Right Hegelians used Hegel's approach to justify the present social world. Thus, the left use of Hegel sought transition and praxis, whereas the right use of Hegel sought a conservative justification of the present. For Marx, what was required was a utilisation of Hegel's ideas to continue pushing forward, to move beyond the Prussian autocracy which he despised. For Marx, the social world remained one of conflict. It seemed ludicrous to suggest that with Hegel, dialectics had come to an end. Conflict remained very much in the social world. And for Marx, and this is the crucial aspect where Marx diverges from Hegel, this conflict doesn't exist in the world of ideas. Rather, it exists in the social world. For Hegel, it is the conflict of ideas which determines our social world. For Marx, it is the conflict in the social world which determines our ideas. In this regard, we can talk of Marx having a materialist inversion of Hegel's idealism. Hegel says that ideas determine the world, whereas Marx says the world determines our ideas. And while Marx says the world determines our ideas, it's a particular feature of the world which determines our ideas. It is the mode of production which dominates the world around us. This approach is referred to as historical materialism, and you can think of it as being the same as dialectical materialism. These are broadly the same thing. As far as Marx is concerned, History is a result of material conditions. The mode of production dominates the ideas of the society. History is not driven by ideas, it's rather driven by the world around us. This term, historical materialism, while almost synonymous with Marxism, was in fact used first by Engels, not by Marx, in Engels' text Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. The core summary, which I think has this which encapsulates the core of historical materialism, is written in Marx's Groundwork to Capital, the so-called Grundrisse, when he writes that, quote, society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of interrelations, the relations within which these individuals stand. By relations and relationality here, Marx refers to the form of political economy, where stuff gets made, who controls production, what are the relations of production within society. For Marx, production is crucial. Humans have to produce to survive. We need food, we need shelter, we need warmth. How this occurs, how we develop and produce, this is the relations of production at any given time in society. For Marx, this base of productive activity is the core of the social world and determines everything else. The various stages of history that humanity has progressed through, as far as Marx is concerned, can primarily be understood as differentiated on the basis of their varying mode of production, be it primarily feudal or capitalist or tribal or primitive communist. For Marx, then, historical materialism suggests that we need to view the social world as a result of the particular form of production which is occurring at any given time. History, unlike for Hegel, is not a product of ideas, rather is a product of the world around us. What matters is our relations of production in society. For Marx, ultimately, production is what determines social life. A central part of Marx's sociology is his analysis of Entfremdung, or alienation. This was part of the humanist Marxism, or the early Marx. Authors such as Louis Althusser suggest we can view there being two different Marxes. A Marx of the early writings, which his focus is more humanist on how people feel, on their awareness and phenomenology, their suffering within capitalism, and a later Marx, the Marx whose concerns are more explicitly economic. In this framework, we can see Marx as transitioning from an analysis primarily of humanist alienation to a political, economic, perhaps even accelerationist bent with capital. But let's focus now on alienation in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844. For Marx, there are different types of alienation, which we'll discuss, but of primacy for Marx, the problem is that human beings under capitalism are alienated from their labour. The word labour to us sounds quite unpleasant, associated with childbirth and tedious employment. But that's not really what Marx means. The use of the word labour perhaps is better to think of the word projects. Human beings love doing things. It's crucial to being a person. You can't just sit still and do nothing. We watch Netflix, we go for a walk, we meet friends, we go to the pub. These are all forms of labour. We are doing something. We have to do something. Being human requires us to constantly make our mark on the world, to learn, to relax. But we can never sit still. Something has to be going on in our heads to keep us occupied. Now, in capitalism, this fundamental human power, Marx says, our labour power, is used against us. We lose control of it because we are forced to sell our labour if you are a member of the proletariat. For Marx, the central class distinction is between those who sell their labour, the proletariat, and those who buy the labour and utilise it to make money. The people who buy the labour are referred to as the bourgeoisie. For Marx, we lose our capacity to determine how we do things when we sell our labour. And this loss of freedom hurts us. We no longer have the right to think for ourselves, to act in the way we think makes sense. Those of you who are working in supermarket jobs, or working for Uber or Deliveroo, will be able to associate, I think, with this sentiment. You're at the disposal, your body, your mind, your capacity to make a difference in the world. It's not fully yours. You're alienated from it. For X number of hours a day, your creative capacities are no longer fully yours. And this loss of freedom, this loss of capacity, this souled loss of capacity is central to the Marxist understanding of alienation. Now, for Marx, there are four kinds of alienation. From the product which you're making, it's no longer yours. You don't have the affinity towards it. If you're working at Costa or Starbucks to make a cup of coffee, it must be made in a certain way. The act of production is something just taken away from you. Your engagement with other people is modified. You can't laugh and joke. You can't behave naturally, organically. And the basis of what it is to fundamentally be human, your species essence or your species being, as Marx framed it, the capacity to work together collectively towards a shared goal out of your mutual shared interest in being human. That fundamental productive drive, the desire to do something, is taken from you. For Marx, then, alienation is a central pathology of capitalism. And these four kinds of alienation interact in a way that forms a tremendous psychopathology. To exist as a proletarian in capitalism is to suffer this particular kind of alienation. And for Marx, there is something particularly brutal about the way in which our labour power is sold. Not only do we lose control of our capacity to project in the world around us, but we are also, for Marxists, a victim of a system of theft. The core basis of Marxist economics can be summarised by the formula presented above. MC, M apostrophe. What this refers to is a cycle in which a capitalist starts with money. They convert this money into a commodity, and they then sell that commodity for more money than they used to buy their commodities. How does this work? Where does this profit come from? For Marxists, who subscribe to the theory of surplus value, this profit comes from one place only, the theft of the worker's labour. Not only are you being alienated when you're working for Sainsbury's or Tesco's, not only have you lost your capacity to determine those hours of your day, but the process of surrendering this alienation is also one in which you're being structurally exploited and underpaid. Let's explain this in detail in the next slide. So let's apply this MCM logic. What does it look like? This is, of course, a crude simplification of the sophistication of Marx's work, but also of the complexities that exist in the marketplace. However, in summary, the idea is that you start off with money. The capitalist starts off with money. Let's say £50, the original M. And they use money to buy commodities. A commodity is a word that means anything that can be bought and sold. And as Marx says, labour, your labour power, is something that can be bought and sold. So let's say the capitalist says, I want to build a chair, and I've got £50. I'm going to spend £20 on wood and £30 on a labourer who's going to come and use their tools to build this chair for me. The labourer requires this deal because they do not have the capacity to buy that £20 worth of wood, hypothetically. £50 then is converted into £50 of commodity. £20 wood, £30 labour. When the chair is ready, the capitalist sells it for £200. This isn't that unbelievable. A nice chair could go for a fair bit of money. Where does that additional £150 come from? For Marxists, the answer is simple. The labour of the worker has been stolen. The labourer is fundamentally exploited by the capitalist system. Their labour is systematically underappreciated. The labour market exists for the benefit of the capitalist. If the labourer was paid their fair share, there would be no profit for the capitalist. Rather, the original cost should be £50 for the chair, because the correct value of the labour that went into it would have been £30. As it is in this summary, the actual value of the labour suggested is £180, of which the labourer is only paid £30. That extra £150 in the theory of surplus value for Marxists is simply stolen from the labourer by the capitalist. Just as Rousseau wrote in the Second Discourse, that civil society is the problem, and that the values and norms and ethics and culture and science and arts simply serve to invisibilize the irrationality of a system based on private property. Marxists would suggest that at core what we have in the world around us is a capitalist system based on theft, based on an economic base of M-C-M apostrophe, of the extraction of surplus value from the labourer. Upon this base is an entire social superstructure, an ideological artifice of norms and values, of a civil society that is constructed just to justify the irrational system. Marxists thus consider ideology to be central to the maintenance of capitalist society. The economic base is what is held to drive society. Remember, historical materialism suggests that the form of productive labour which is dominant in society, that is what determines the form the society takes. At core then, the economic base is dominant, and the superstructure is merely contingent upon this economic foundation. Marx's work and his influence on sociology has been phenomenal. He is perhaps the most famous conflict theorist, and his understanding of capitalism as being far from a fair, meritocratic system, but a system doomed to crisis, full of chaos, full of extraction and exploitation, has provided a powerful global framework, with Naxalite movements in India to revolutionaries in Cuba and Latin America. Marx's account of sociology has had a global impact. There are two key ways we can talk about Marx's sociology and his philosophy producing a fundamental impact within the academy. The first is an analysis which puts the relations of production of primacy within our sociological research. This is stressed as a core tenet of historical materialism. The second, which I think can be viewed as Marx's moment of genius even by his detractors, is the Copernican revolution in which he inverted Hegel's idealism. Recall that for Marxists, it is not a result of our ideas creating the world around us. Rather, in a view which becomes pretty much second nature to our understanding of socialization today, the world around us creates our ideas. Marxist views are thus central in this regard to understanding everything from gender and the creation of gendered subjects to critical theory, where Marxist ideas continue more explicitly in the work today of Michael J. Thompson, Axel Honneth, Rainer Forst, and Nancy Fraser. The impact is also prevalent in international relations, and those who study political Marxism or have drawn upon the work of Benno Teschke. Political Marxism is a tremendously important area of emerging research, and something which various IR theorists here at Brookes are well schooled in. Marx's influence in sociology is thus hard to deny. What's important, as we write on the next slide, is that a Marxist academic is not the same as a Marxist politician. This really is a crucial difference. Most academics would say that Marxism is a useful way of understanding society. They would say that actually there are times in which functionalism can be useful, Symbolic interactionism can be useful, but Marxism can be useful. Different perspectives help us understand different aspects of the social world. This is a balanced, nuanced understanding which I expect most sociologists you would ask would sign up to. Sometimes it helps us understand aspects of the social world by using Marxist ideas. Sometimes functionalist ideas, sometimes symbolic interactionist ideas. Few people would genuinely disagree with that, I suggest. However, that does not mean that while most sociologists accept some utility in a Marxist account, does not mean that most sociologists are going to be calling for a revolution, particularly not in the style of the regimes built in Marx's name. An embrace of the utility of core tenets of Marxist sociology does not require, for a second, an embrace of the barbaric and totalitarian regimes which were set up in the name of Marxism. Ironically, Marx himself famously said, when it became clear the way his ideas were being used, "I am not a Marxist." To repeat, Karl Marx stressed he was not a Marxist on the way the term was used by many of the political people utilising his frames of reference. Marxism is thus presented in this lecture and is something which will occur throughout your degree programme as a useful way of understanding society. It is one useful way amongst others. You're not being encouraged to think of Marxism as superior or infallible, not by any stretch of the imagination. What you're being encouraged to do is to understand the immanent coherence of this approach, so you are able to apply it, critique it, and engage with it sympathetically. This is what is required of you from this degree programme, the ability to understand a range of theoretical perspectives, to understand them on their own terms, and to provide immanent critique and to understand the immanent coherence of various theoretical perspectives. And with this in mind, I wish to draw out three final key features of Marx's sociology. Firstly, I want to comment on a tremendously misunderstood quote from a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Marx is famously quoted as saying religion is the opium of the people, which is read by many people as suggesting he hated religion and that it was a thing for stupid people and simple as that. Whereas the reality is that Marx says religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. By this, what Marx actually means is that in capitalism, where people are suffering and exploited with the degree of brutality that we were seeing arms being ripped off in machines and people starving in the streets, people turn to religion not out of stupidity or ignorance, but because it provides a balm to them. It provides an opiate, provides something that genuinely seems to soothe their suffering. This is thus a more nuanced understanding of religion. But for Marx at the same time, this turn to religion prevents radical transformation. Marx is certainly not a fan of religion, but he's neither a simplistic anti-theist who views religion to be solely an idiotic waste of time. For Marx, religion has a crucial function in the maintenance of the capitalist system. Thus, he writes, a central task for critical thinkers is to critique religion. With the critique of religion becomes the critique of the actual existing inequalities in society. A second emphasis I wish to stress on Marx's sociology is that it is a form of social criticism. He is subjecting the social world to a stark critique, but is not done on the basis of a liberal imaginary. Marx isn't saying that capitalism is insufficiently just or lacks legitimacy. Rather, Marx's central claim is that capitalism is irrational. He draws upon Hegelian themes. And not only does he say it is irrational, but it is doomed to failure. Rahel Yegi would say that we should understand Marx as critiquing capitalism as a form of life itself. For Marx, a radical change is needed. Human self-realization is impossible within the ossifying and extractive nature of capitalist relations. The solution for Marx, as articulated in 1848 in the Communist Manifesto, is revolution. The working men, says Marx, have the world to win and only their chains to lose. The final point I wish to stress is that Marx was wrong. For Marx, there was an inevitability to the overthrow of the capitalist system. For Marx, there was a clear teleology, a clear progression. Over time, says Marx, the working classes would get poorer and poorer and poorer, and revolution would become inevitable. On this, Marx was wrong. Particularly in the West, we witnessed the rise of the $5 day of Fordism. We witnessed the rise of an increasingly placated middle class. Liberals, scared of revolution, in Marxist eyes, offered welfare. The capitalist system chugs on the basis, for Marxists, of the cracks being forever papered over. There hasn't been a revolution in England, at least not as Marx predicted. In the 1920s, tanks were deployed in Scotland, battleships fired on the north of England. There is a history of revolution in England which we're not taught about in schools. We came very close to having a communist revolution here in the UK. But it didn't happen. And for Marx, that is remarkable. He was certain the revolution would have come by now, and that capitalism would have crumbled. What's interesting is the survivability of the capitalist form, how capitalism continues to reinvent itself, be it in our readings of Susanna Zuboff and surveillance capitalism, or the forms of green capitalism, offering the possibility of an antidote to global warming through growth-based investment. Capitalism seems remarkably resilient. In this regard, in a basic level of prediction, Marx was incorrect. He thus provides us with an essential infrastructure for engaging with political economy. However, at the most foundational level, he was wrong. The revolution has not happened. At least, it's not happened yet. 3 key questions for you to think about after this lecture, which we'll take up again in our seminar. Question 1. Is Marx's materialist inversion of Hegel justified? It's a bit wordy, so let's break that down. What that means is, for Hegel, ideas dominate the world around us. Do we think, with Hegel, that the world around us is the product of our ideas? Or do we think with Marx that our ideas are a result of the world around us? Question 2. Do you feel alienated from your work and your studies? Do you feel alienation in your daily life? And if so, why and how? And question 3. Do you think MCM' holds today as an analysis for most profit-producing economic activity? Do you feel as though Marx's theory of surplus value, as explained very crudely and very simply in this lecture, has some analytic potency? And if not, what areas do you think need to be added for this to provide an adequate understanding of the social world? Thank you again for listening to this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in the seminars. Please don't hesitate to email me, nharris@brooks.ac.uk, with any questions or queries. Thank you.